Hello and welcome to the Behind the Badge podcast. For several years, we have been presenting stories from a public safety perspective. Today, we have an interview with Keith Sharon, a gifted true crime journalist, movie writer, and now a true crime podcaster based in Nashville. Our own Cindy Arora will be speaking with him today about his career and his most recent podcast about one of the most shocking homicides in the history of Music City.
So let's just start with a softball for me on, just tell us who you are and your writing career from journalist, scriptwriter to podcast.
So I'm Keith Sharon. I've been in the business since 1981, before most of your listeners were even born. This is my 43rd year in the business. I took one break because I wrote a screenplay that was made into a Hollywood movie called Showtime with Robert De Niro and Eddie Murphy in the early 2000s. So I think I wrote the screenplay in 1998 and 1999, and I was a reporter at the Orange County Register at the time. And immediately when I got my contract with Warner Brothers, I quit the Register. And I think I was off for 2 years, and it was great to write a Hollywood script, and especially when I heard that De Niro and Eddie Murphy were going to do the movie, and Will Smith was a producer, and William Shatner had a cameo that I wrote especially for him, and they invited me to the set, and it was just an incredible time in my life. But then I couldn't sell the second screenplay, and I wrote 5 or 6 or more screenplays, including one about a bank heist that I'll get to in a minute. But I came crawling back to the Orange County Register in 2000 or 2001 and said, this Hollywood thing, I can't be a waiter. I've got a wife and kids and a dog and a house and a car. I can't be doing the let's wait and see what happens until your next screenplay sells kind of thing. It just made me really nervous. So I went back to the Register and got my old job back, and I've been a journalist pretty much ever since. But around that time, one of my first stories back in the early 2000s was about a bank heist from 1972, and it became a 10-part series in the Register, and a movie company bought the rights to it and asked me to write the screenplay, which I did. And then 16 years later, the movie got made. And so that's the, it's the greatest and the worst part of Hollywood right there, is that I wouldn't imagine if I had waited. Where would I'd be homeless. Where would the money come from? And then finally it paid off, and I had the second bite at the red carpet. It was called Finding Steve McQueen. It premiered in 2019, and it had Travis Fimmel and Forrest Whitaker and Rachel Taylor. And it was a great night. We had a premiere in Orange County, near where the heist took place. And so yeah, the Hollywood chapter of my life was incredible, full of highs and lows. And I hope that it extends, because we've had some movie interest in this podcast. Yeah. So that leads me into my journalism career. I've done everything in the business. I started in sports way back in the 1980s. I've covered cops and courts and general assignment in schools. I was a children's reporter for a while. I've done investigations. I was involved in the Register's toxic treats coverage that was a finalist for the Pulitzer in 2005. But my thing, the thing that I love most, and the thing that I've developed over time, is I love true crime. And I used to talk to Bill Rams about crime stories all the time. And I got an iPhone in 2015 or 2016. I can't remember exactly. And I noticed for the first time that there's a purple button on the iPhone that says podcast. And I swear to God, I didn't know at the time what a podcast was. And I hit it. And the first one that popped up, when I searched true crime, because that's what I love. And the first one that popped up was called Accused. And it was from the Cincinnati Enquirer. And I loved it. It was a murder story, real life murder story from the 70s or 80s. And I noticed at the very end, they did the credits and they thanked Amy Wilson. And Amy Wilson and I used to sit next to each other at the Orange County Register. She had moved on and she was now at Cincinnati and she was an editor. So I called her and started this kind of like second relationship with her. She was my friend as a long form feature writer at the Register. And now she was my friend as a podcaster in Cincinnati. So we would talk all the time about podcasts, and I just got this bug. I've got to do a podcast. So I did one for the Register, and we called it Crime Beat. And it was about the bank heist that I wrote the screenplay about. And so the podcast covered the crime, and then it covered the movie. And so that was great. Loved every minute of that. And then I talked to Bill Rams one day, and he said, Kathy Torres was stuffed in the trunk of her own car, and that would be an incredible podcast. And so I launched season 2 of Crime Beat with my editor, Todd Harmonson. And that was great. But my wife retired in 2020. We wanted this big adventure in our lives. So I put out some feelers and I got interest in Nashville, and the Tennessean offered me a job. So I came. And it wasn't long after I got here. I started in 2021. So in 2022, my old friend Amy Wilson came to speak. She had since won the Pulitzer Prize for coverage in Cincinnati. She came to speak to our staff, and she had dinner with our editors, and they talked to her about her great podcast, Accused, which she was the editor on. Amber Hunt is the host, and Amanda Rossman, remember that name, she's the sound editor for Accused. Amy told them about the ups and downs of making a podcast, and my boss suggested that there's this story in Nashville that would make a great podcast. And she said, well, you've got a great podcaster sitting on your staff right now, my old friend Keith Sharon. So the next day, my boss called me in and said, let's launch a podcast. And I thought, oh, this is incredible. It like the whole world went full circle. Here was Amy suggesting me, and so we launched. And eventually, spoiler alert, we hired Amanda Rossman, Amy's sound editor, to be the sound editor on Murder on Music Row. So that's the very quick Hollywood journalism rundown right there.
So where did your affection for police, true crime, where did that all come from?
I thought about that. I think it came from when I was a kid. I was a member of the book club in school, where you fill out the form, you give the teacher the money, and then 6 weeks later, a book arrives. Mm-hmm. One of the first books I ever got in 3rd or 4th grade was Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. And I was so fascinated by this crime story and how I could be fooled, how I could read the whole thing and not know who did it until the very last page. And oh my goodness, it's like the greatest whodunit caper ever. And from that moment on, for the last 50 years, I've been hooked. I couldn't get enough of Agatha Christie and the Hardy Boys. So that's not even true crime. That's just fiction, crime fiction.
Yeah.
And then becoming a journalist, there were these stories all around me, breaking news, bodies found, and police and like the work of detectives, and I got to know a few of them, and I got to know a few of the reporters who covered crime stories, and they just became my favorite to tell. I think it's because there's a figuring out kind of element to it. As a journalist, you can participate, you can get as close as you want to being a detective. And so I like to become obsessed. That's my thing, is I get a topic and I sink my teeth into it and I become obsessed. And that's what I've done with this story.
So did you have the idea for your new podcast before you got a podcast, or did you, or, you know, what came first? Because it sounds like you had a few years to work on this. I mean,
it's almost been 2 years. I always wanted to do another podcast. And I still like going forward. I want to do season 2, and I want to do other things down the road. But I didn't know the history of Nashville. It was all so new to me. And I was busy writing. I was doing regional reporting. I think I flew to New Orleans 10 times in the first 2 years I was here, doing stories about hurricanes and special education and poverty in certain communities. I went to Alabama, Montgomery. I went to Jackson, Mississippi, and did a story about water, the water trouble that they had there. So I was really busy. But when Amy came, it kind of reignited this love for podcasts. So my boss, Ben Goad, called me in, and he said he had had dinner with Amy the night before, and they talked about, wouldn't it be great if I could do a podcast? And I said, yes, that's a great idea. And he reached in his desk drawer and he pulled out a flash drive, the old kind that fits in the side of your laptop. And he said, here are the police files from this great murder case from 1989. And Ben himself had always recognized that this would be a great podcast. In fact, he had done some interviews back 2, 3, 4 years ago of some of the people involved in the case, and he had recorded them. So he gave me the police reports, coroner reports, FBI files, photos. They were all in this zip drive, and also recordings of a couple of the witnesses in the case. So I started off way ahead. I had all that. And then I just started going, and it's been a 2-year obsession of mine.
it's so multi-layered. I mean, I would love to know, the difference. Is there a difference in reporting or how you pull things together from print versus podcast versus, script writing? Because you have to do a lot of research for fiction as well. So, I would just.
Yes. What I had to learn was to prioritize sound. And when you are a print person, like I have been for so long, my notebook was the most important thing. Getting great quotes, having my notes, getting my notes in order, scanning my notes, like the whole thing would come out of my notebook. And I had to learn how to conduct an interview for a podcast where the sound of the person and myself was more important than that.
Mm.
Like I made a mistake when I was in California. I made a mistake right away. The very first interview I did for the very first season of Crime Beat, I thought, wouldn't it be cool to do it in a bar? Because I want the sound of tinkling glasses and, the music in the background and the waitress coming to the table and all that stuff, right? Well, when you do that, you can't edit because the sounds all get mixed up. And if there's a song in the background, you have to put it at exactly the same spot where the song was when you cut, or it sounds really stupid. So I thought that's the worst decision I ever made, was to do this major interview in a public place, in a bar like that. So here in Tennessee, we've got a podcast studio. So I would invite people to show up at the office. We would mic them up, put them in front of a big fuzzy microphone, and do interviews there. And it's just it's more conversational, where the tone, like the listener can understand the context, but you can tell things from the sounds of people's voice. Who's nervous, who may not be telling the truth, who's overselling a certain thing about the story, who's underplaying. All that is revealed in the way it sounds. So I had to kind of learn about the importance of sound that way.
That's interesting. I mean, it really kind of merges your TV or your movie writing with I mean, it feels very similar in some.
Right.
So I'm curious, because on your first episode, I was very intrigued by the fact that you felt a little scared, that a lot of your people that you were trying to interview were scared. And so I haven't been able to binge the whole yet, so I don't know if you discussed that more. But I mean, can you talk a little bit about, unveiling the story and just, it sounds like you were jabbing a hornet's nest a bit. So just would love to know what that's like for you and for the people you're interviewing.
Well, so far I have survived. So that's the good news. But I think I was, you have to remember when you're doing something like this, that these are real lives. This is not fiction. And there are people who were suspected of a crime, and I'm not going to shy away from talking to them. There are people who witnessed a crime, and I've got to talk to them. There are family members who are crestfallen by the long tentacles of this crime, and I've got to talk to them. So I have to force myself to get sound from all of these different people. And here's what I started to notice. I would call up a person in the music industry, and they would say, let's meet at a place that is out of the way, off the interstate, where nobody will see me or recognize me, in a booth in the back, and don't bring any recording equipment. And I'm like, okay, well, that's not really going to help the podcast. So they said, well, but show up. So I go there, and this person says to me, as long as some people involved in this case are still alive, you had better watch your back. Wow. And I was like, really? So this danger runs deep. And this person said, oh yeah, you've got to be careful. Just about that time, I had put out a lot of feelers on social media, Facebook direct messages, some direct messages on Twitter, some cold call phone calls where I get the person's answering machine and I would leave my number. And I got these 2 messages on Instagram from people who said, there is no way I am going to be involved in this. I still have family. I want to be safe. And if I sound scared, it's because I am. And that was right around the time that the other person had warned me to watch my back. So I swear I check my surroundings when I park in the morning in the parking garage. I'm aware of my surroundings when I go home at night, because this case has some dastardly people involved in it. And I'm sure that you focused in on the strange Sunday evening I had where I got a text from a person whose number I didn't recognize. This was right in the middle of the reporting of this story, and I think I had reached out to 170 people asking, could I interview you about murder, the old Murder on Music Row case? And and I was waiting to hear back. So I didn't know who it was who I had contacted, and I was getting these texts. I can meet with you tonight. Okay, where? No, I'm going to set the rules. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to write down the name of the person you think I am. Now, I didn't know if this was a man or a woman. I didn't know young or old. I didn't know what their connection to the case was, but I was supposed to guess at who was sending me these anonymous texts. So they said, get an envelope, write my name on a piece of paper, put it in the envelope, go to this bar, and they gave me the address. It was 40 miles from my house. So I drive to the bar. I have no idea what's going to happen. I sit in a booth and I'm, trying to make eye contact with everyone who's around me to see, are they looking at me like who's going to approach? Finally, I see a person come in and they walk straight to my booth, and all they say is, where's the envelope? So I reach in my sport coat pocket, I pull out the envelope, I hand it to them, and they rip it open, and they look at me and say, you got it wrong. And I said, well, who are you? And they sat down and explained who they were. And they said that if I would not have had an envelope with a name in it, they were going to turn around and walk out. I guess I earned their trust by following the directions. And that person gave me infinite behind the scenes, never reported stuff on the case.
Wow.
And still didn't want to be identified, even though I begged them over and over to just come on the podcast. We'll doctor your voice. We'll put you in the dark. We'll hide you, and they would not. So one of the main sources of the podcast is someone who has never come forward and has never revealed what they know, but you'll pick up on it as you listen.
Oh, wow. I mean, so what is your feeling when you're having these, all the president's men moments? I mean, it sounds like, this should be a movie. Like, who will play you in your movie? Because this.
Oh, man. Obviously Nicolas Cage. I think that Nicolas Cage could play me. He could do me service. So I'm rooting for Nicolas Cage in the movie. We have, I think, 6 or 7 movie companies who have made inquiries about buying the rights, and we are in discussion. There's a lot of decisions to be made. Do you go with straight documentary, talking heads kind of a treatment of this story, or do you fictionalize it and say inspired by true events and then create characters? Because of my background and because of my love, I am rooting for the feature film kind of a treatment of this story where I can make up some things, fill in some holes with fictionalized things that didn't really happen in real life. That's what I'm rooting for. But who knows? People in Gannett, our parent company, are involved in making the decisions about what happens with the rights of this story.
Yeah, I'm rooting for a feature film. I think it would be great. You can have cool music, Taylor Swift, like you can really have fun with this. So
one of the things that attracted me from the jump, and this is going to sound weird given what I've said, I knew from talking to my boss that the murder story was incredible.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like from the moment I started, I had a murder story in my back pocket. What I wanted to do was write the history of Nashville. And I wanted to talk about how a song becomes a hit and how a singer becomes a star and how a record is produced and how people go from getting off the bus from Iowa and becoming Garth Brooks, that kind of thing. And that was another driving force in this. I would say that half of this podcast is about star making in Nashville. And what I found was there's two sides to that coin. Sure, there's the Garth Brooks, Faith Hill model of you play in birthday parties in backyards, you play in a bowling alley, you play at a writer's night at a local steakhouse, and you get discovered because some influential person is in the audience and gets you to Capitol Records like Garth Brooks did.
Mm-hmm.
However, there's the other side of Nashville in which you get off the bus from Cincinnati and the person who's in the audience listening to you is a criminal bastard who wants to manipulate you in order to take every dime you've ever made. And that's what happened in this story. Was I found that there was this group of independent music promoters just waiting to prey on people as they came to Nashville. And the way they did it became like this quest for me to find. And so I would interview, I found this music chart from Cashbox magazine, which was the smallest of the insider trade publications. So these weren't the Garth Brooks and Randy Travis and the Judds. These weren't those people. These were people you'd never heard of, and suddenly they're number one on the independent country chart in Cashbox magazine. And what I found was that chart was completely corrupt, and they were buying their way onto the chart, and producers and promoters from Nashville, unethical types, were manipulating that chart to get their new singer who they represent onto it without selling a single record, playing a show in town, without having a song played on the radio. And all of a sudden they're number 3 with a bullet on the new hot country chart, when really it's all fake.
Mm-hmm.
And the person between the chart and the singers was named Kevin Hughes.
Wow.
He was the chart director for Cashbox magazine. He was a 23-year-old kid who went to a Christian college here, now named Belmont University. In 1989, it was Belmont College. And his dream was to work for the Gospel Music Association. This was a real Midwestern kid from Carmi, Illinois, and raised on a farm, and came to Nashville with all the good intentions of being on the business end of drinking and cheating songs. And he worked his way up to a really influential and powerful position at a really young age, chart director at Cashbox magazine. Well, what he soon found was that position was something that was coveted by a bunch of criminals. Because if they could manipulate that guy, and he would move songs based on who paid and who didn't, then they could make a lot of money getting people to buy their influence. So there was this giant payola scheme going on. And everybody in town seemed to know about it, and nobody did anything about it until Kevin Hughes took 2 bullets in the back of the head, execution style, right in the middle of Music Row, which is 16th Avenue South, for the people in Nashville who know that street. But so again, murder is fascinating. The case was cold for 13 years. It took an investigative miracle to get justice in 2002 or 2003, some semblance of justice. And then I found stuff where some other people might be implicated. There might have been a wider ranging conspiracy than has ever been reported in this case. So I was happy with the. I'll just say this: listeners of this podcast will have enough information to be able to form their own opinions about whether true justice was served.
That's great. So where can people find the podcast? Where can people listen? Like, let's give everyone the information.
So there's two main places to find it. And right now, as we speak today, there's only one, but I'll tell you about both. You go to the Tennessean.com and search Murder on Music Row. I'll send you a link for what we call our binge page, where you can listen to the whole thing right now if you subscribe to the Tennessean. We're requiring subscription because my time is worth money. And I spent a lot of time on this. So you can get a subscription, you can hear the whole thing right now, or you can wait till at some point in the summer, maybe a couple of months from now, we're going to start releasing them one by one on all the streaming apps for free. It'll be on Spotify and Apple and Google Play and all that, where you get your normal podcasts. But right now, for the people who want to listen early, you can get it at the Tennessean.com.
Okay, great. All right. So I just want to, formally wrap up, but I still have a couple of questions do you start a new podcast now? Like, how does the podcast work for you guys? Like, now you've invested so much time on this one. Are you on to a new one, or?
So it's kind of it's a wait and see. We want to see the success of this. I think we only, it's been like 3 weeks since we launched episode 1. And we're trying to see how many new subscriptions we get, how many downloads we get. It's trending in the right direction. Let's just say that. So.
All right. That's great. I'll be subscribing. So, and then,
great.
What do you tend to read a lot of true crime or movies? Like, I'd love to know, like, what have you been watching? Are you into the night?
So I watched the Huntington Beach case. Are you a true crime fan?
Yeah, not as much as my sisters. They go to sleep to it, but
yeah. When I'm sitting there with Netflix in front of me, I search British detectives or true crime. Those are those are my two areas. So yeah, I forget what it's called, but it was the Huntington Beach kidnapping case that recently became a Netflix show, and I wrote some of the stories about that case several years ago. If you can cuss on this chat, there's a Netflix show called Don't Fuck with Cats that I thought was incredible. It's a true crime investigative story, which I thought was great. Oh boy, I'm trying to think. I watched so many of them that it's hard to put them in order. Obviously, the Jinx, which just finished season 2, was incredible. Making a Murderer is another one, of course, that I was in on early. And then podcasts. Serial was the start of it all, and I think the best, even better than Serial, was a podcast called In the Dark, by a journalist named Madeline Barron. She did 2 seasons, and I just can't wait for her season 3. So yeah, I listen to two true crime podcasts a day, one driving in. I have a 30-minute commute, so I listen to one driving in and one driving home. And right now I'm listening to Fallen Angels, the LA Times investigation into a USC doctor. So
great. That's really great. Okay. So how long have you been in Nashville now? A couple of years?
Yeah, I arrived in Nashville the day after January 6th,
Oh,
the attack on the Capitol. So I was driving, I was in like Little Rock or Memphis the day before when on January 6th when I was hearing that the Capitol was under attack. And so I arrived on January 7th of 2021.
and so how has it been? I mean, are you a California kid, or I mean, what's
Well,
your
yes, I'm a California kid, but I'm a California kid who wanted a big adventure, and it has lived up to the adventure part. Every restaurant we go into is new. I'm always trying the barbecue, the IPAs, the local beers. We live in a city where a tiny town where we see more cows than people, and it's really a rural experience. We have a housing development like you would find in Orange County, but it's surrounded by family farms and a little town called Franklin, which is about 8 miles away from us. Has the old downtown. Looks like it was built in the 1950s with the town square and all that stuff. So that's really close to us. And then Nashville, you've got Lower Broadway, which, so I say in the podcast, many people mistakenly call that Music Row. Really, Music Row is several streets where studios and record labels have office buildings. They in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, they converted old houses into music studios. So it's kind of this cool area, but that's where the business takes place. When you come to Nashville, if you're here for a bachelorette party, you're going to go downtown to Lower Broadway, where Luke Bryan and Jason Aldean and Dierks Bentley and now Garth Brooks, and even last week John Bon Jovi opened a bar downtown, 3-story bar with live music, and it's crazy down there. And the hockey arena, Bridgestone Arena, is there. We saw Eric Clapton there a couple years ago. So I love it. It's great. Everything's new, and that's why we came.
That sounds really fun. So, I noticed you talked a lot about Bluebird Cafe. Is that the place? I mean, I remember the movie. I saw the movie in 1993, A Thing Called Love with River Phoenix. I don't know if you ever saw it, but it's all about people trying to get their start at the Bluebird Cafe. Like that's where everybody went. So then I heard you talking a lot about it.
So I'm not sure how much magic is left. I think that social media presence, money, who in the business sometimes is more important than the venue. But I'll tell you this, in 1989, the Bluebird Cafe was the spot. I talked to Tony Arora, who wrote the song The Dance for Garth Brooks, and he played it at the Bluebird Cafe one night, and Garth Brooks was in the audience, and Garth asked him after the show, can I record that? And that's the old way, the old school way of making it in Nashville. That's where Faith Hill was discovered. Taylor Swift played the Bluebird. There's a great documentary called Bluebird, I believe, and it's about the history of the Bluebird Cafe. But I've been there. It's magic to me because of the nostalgia for the place. I don't know how many record deals come out of there now, but I certainly found a lot doing research for this podcast from the early days of country music.
That sounds really neat. I hope to go there one day. So I'm excited for your movie. I think that this was great. I hope it works out so I can
Fingers crossed.
Screen. Yeah. So if you don't mind, just again sharing where people can listen to your podcast and binge it.
So to listen to Murder on Music Row, go to the Tennessean.com and search for my name, Keith Sharon, or Murder on Music Row. And we've done several stories. There's a whole narrative written piece that I did with 8 parts about the crime, and you can find it there.
Okay, great. Hold on, I'm going to pause it.